So welcome to Parallel Session 10.1 of the What Works Global Summit 2022. It's about the effectiveness of policy initiatives to support lobby and advocacy work on all kinds of good causes, but we focus on dialogue, dissent, sexual and reproductive health rights, in which the Netherlands government in total spends over 1 billion euros. So IOB, which is the independent policy evaluation directorate of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, decided to do an evaluation. And this session will be on the question, how can we evaluate those kind of policy initiatives in a good manner? And I'm very happy to introduce our colleagues, the researchers from the Campbell collaboration, Hugh, Sharma, Waddington. Are you there, Hugh?
No, Hugh can't speak.
No, you can't speak. He's still fighting some technical issues. But Howard, you are there. Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
So that also goes for Hikari Umezawa. Welcome to you, Hikari. And we have also a few excellent panelists. Vaessen, welcome. Karel, Chambille, also welcome. And Casey Davison-O'Brien for joining us. Thank you also to the attendees. As I said, we think it's important to do an evaluation on this, especially on the question, how can we do evaluations that are thorough in terms of focusing on the effectiveness of the work that we set out to stimulate in this regard. The aim is to learn from the work that we asked the Campbell collaboration to do for us. I think an important question is, what are good evaluations of this kind of work? Are there criteria? Which recommendations can we think of? So we'll be discussing those. In this study, the Campbell collaboration study has looked at 32 studies and external evaluations, 25 for the Dialogue and Dissent program, and 7 for the Sexual Reproductive Health Rights Partnership Fund. So activities funded from these two programs were implemented, by the way, in almost 130 countries. Without further ado, I would like to invite Hugh and his colleagues to present the results of your study. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Hugh, can you share the slides, please? Yeah, there we go. Okay, thanks very much. So thank you very much for the introduction, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be here. So this is a team and the Grants with Campbell collaboration, actually the Global Development Network, but the team comes across from various parts of the world. But next slide. So the motivation for this work is this change in focus of development assistance, particularly Dutch development assistance, where it's shifted, at least in part, and the part we're looking at, from focusing on anti-poverty programs to trying to tackle the root causes of poverty, particularly through support, lobbying and advocacy. LNA is lobbying and advocacy. We're also looking at sexual reproductive health and rights, SRHR, and of course SHRH also has a focus on rights, a rights-based approach, and Dutch assistance's area has a very strong focus on the rights aspect of SRHR. And so it is very much about tackling root causes of poverty and lack of development through looking at systemic issues and trying to tackle those. And so whilst there's some parts of these programs, particularly in the SRHR arena, less so in the lobbying advocacy, that might be tackled by traditional large N impact evaluations, be it randomized control trials or non-experimental methods, but large statistical methods, many of them can't. So it's well recognized that we can't use these large statistical designs in this particular area, but we still want to assess the question about causality. And this piece of work we're doing for IOB is very focused on the causality question in the evaluations we're looking at. We're not suggesting at all that's the only evaluation of question of relevance or interest. Of course, it's clearly not. There are many other evaluation questions of relevance and interest that can be answered by different methods, and they should be retained, of course. But the focus of this particular study is on this causal question. I think that's very important. Many people who do know me think of me as being a quantitative researcher, impact evaluation, blah blah blah, and I'm really not. I've always been a mixed method researcher, but I am particularly interested in causality in social systems and causality in interventions. And so in this area of this, where you need to tackle small n, small n approaches to tackling causality, it's very challenging. And one reason why we're doing this work is 10 years ago, I was called for a paper with Daniel Phillips on small n impact evaluation. And one of the main findings of that paper was a lot of studies in this area at that time were actually very vague about their methods for establishing causality. I mean, literally, they would say, our method is to use mixed methods. But that's not a method, it's just you're going to mix methods. What methods are you going to mix? So it's not a method per se. So there's a lack of precision, and this is 10 years ago, about what the methods were to be used. And so there's some common elements in those studies we looked at. They were looked around as having a theory of change, ruling out alternative causal explanations, and so on. But it's actually coming to establish a more clear causal statement. Which is done in social sciences, it's done in history, for example, and so on. And so it's not doable, it's not done, was often surprisingly weak. Even when they had a method like, say, contribution analysis, it remained weak. And so one point that was clear, maybe we didn't emphasize enough in that paper, and it's often actually not emphasized enough in the studies. We did this study at the same time DFID, as it then was, published another paper led by Nicholas Stern on small n approaches. And I think actually the Stern paper emphasized more than our paper the fact that in qualitative causal analysis, you talk generally about necessary and sufficient conditions, whereas in quantitative causal analysis, you talk about probabilistic statements. And that's a fundamental difference in talking about causality. There's a very nice book, Tale of Two something, Tale of Two Methods, I think, which is it basically lays it out very clearly and gives a fairly mathematical treatment of the qualitative approaches. Next slide. Oh, it's there. Okay, so this challenge is there's an analogy I use a lot to summarize this necessary and sufficient approach. Suppose you've got a car that doesn't start or won't move. A car doesn't move. So how can you get the car to move? Well, one way is to push it. And so one person can't push a car, it's too heavy. Two people can perhaps move the car, but three people can move the car very easily. And so if three people are pushing a car, well, who's pushing the car? Okay, so any one person can say, oh, I'm pushing the car, but actually that person alone may be necessary, but they're not sufficient. So actually using the language necessary sufficient answers that riddle, who's pushing the car. I used to use this analogy back in the 1990s. I did a lot of work on policy influence, and it's a space which was crowded with many agencies. I did most of my work for the Swedes, some for the Norwegians, some for the Dutch, looking at a bilateral role in policy influence, and they'd all be claiming to, like, we changed fiscal policy in Tanzania single-handedly. It's like, well, there's like 20 actors in this space you can't possibly have done, and trying to figure out who was pushing the car. And a recent example of that is actually some work I was doing earlier this year for the World Bank, looking at country assistance evaluations as part of what I was doing. And a very nice example came from the country assistance evaluation for the Philippines, where in the Philippines, a couple of years ago, introduced a sin tax, so a tax on tobacco and alcohol to subsidize the National Health Insurance Scheme. And if you read the World Bank report, you would think this was the World Bank's doing. The World Bank came up with this idea, the World Bank championed it and persuaded the government of it and helped the government design and implement it. But unfortunately for the world, and they only mentioned the world in the CAE, they only mentioned the World Bank as playing a role in this policy and working the Philippines government to introduce it. But there's a case study by Harvard of this policy. And it's a totally different story of Aquino himself being very keen, despite being a smoker himself, to try and reduce smoking. And he got a Minister for Health in place who, despite being a surgeon, was very keen on preventive health approaches and wanted larger take-up of the National Health Insurance Scheme. And so they decided that we'd like to look at a sin tax, and then the Asia Foundation commissioned a local think tank to do formative research around implementing such attacks. And in this report, they have a list of like 10 different agencies, also did some background analytical work to inform this policy. The World Bank is one of those 10. And that's when it gets mentioned in this report. So back to pushing the car analogy, the World Bank is like the 6th or 7th person pushing the car. Yes, so they're neither necessary nor sufficient. And this is a real problem in this area. If people focus just on what they did, it's called self-importance bias, just focus on what they did, they can hugely overstate their role. So you have to look at what other actors have been doing in that space to understand and make sense of what your role was. I'm still on the car. I'm still on the car. You're racing ahead of me. The car's not moving yet. So you can also use this car, because I said this car's not moving, and you can get people to push it. But if you want to think about it also the inner condition of individually necessary, individually necessary but unnecessary conditions of a sufficient, unnecessary parts of a sufficient condition. If I got that right. So basically, people pushing the car and get it to move, but also you can get a tow truck. So all these people are unnecessary. So one way of pushing the car is getting these people there, but you could have done something else totally different. You could have got a tow truck. You could have put some petrol in it or turn the engine on or whatever is the problem. So it's not necessary these people do solve the problem, but there are other ways of solving that problem too that are totally different. And that's what the units condition captures. So this car analogy works quite well to summarize national sufficient. Now we can roll on. So what we're trying to do with this study. So we're looking at, as Peter mentioned at the start, we're looking across these evidence from 32 large programs giving such support to civil society. We'll mention a few of them in a minute. And so the money goes to civil society organizations in the Netherlands primarily, not only, and that's sort of like the first tier. And the second tier will be going to national level organizations or regional organizations in developing countries who then actually have another tier of lower tier partners all engaged in lobbying advocacy work. There's a bit difference for SRHR, but we're also looking at SRHR programs. Under lobbying advocacy, the largest program is dialogue and dissent, and we're looking primarily at dialogue and dissent programs. So what we're not doing is basically assessing these evaluations against the IOB evaluation criteria. I'll seem to contradict that in a moment, but it's not a contradiction. I'll try and explain why. And so the main purpose of this study is to learn what's being done to evaluate these programs. Where do these evaluations seem to give credible causal stories? Let's learn from those methods and see if we can get them built into the IOB evaluation criteria. And what methods seem not to work so well or are inadequately reported, so we actually can't tell what the method is. As I said, it used to be a problem. I think it's less of a problem now, as we'll see in our findings. Methods are better reported than they used to be. Next slide. So here, as I mentioned, we're looking at Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs support to lobbying and advocacy. It's a lot of money. It's 1.6 billion euros. So it's not like, okay, something to do on the side. It's 1.6 billion euros, which to anyone is quite a lot of money. And under dialogue and dissent, here's a few of the main programs, Freedom from Fear, which gets 50 million euros. I can't actually read these, but you can see the amounts of 50, 30 million euros. So these are individually big programs. We've got program 50 million going to civil society organizations, and a lot of them. So the amount per organization gets to be less and less, but it's still a large amount of money. And some of this is more globally oriented, like the Towards a Worldwide Influencing Network with Oxfam and Novib, which is 78 million, but some is more nationally oriented or regionally oriented. And then SRHR, you've got Bridging the Gap, which is again 50 million, and More Than Brides, which is with Save the Children trying to tackle early marriage, is again nearly 60 million euros. So all of these are big programs. So to talk about this focus on causality, which has been criticised a bit by the stakeholders we've engaged with, and they say, but look, these are good programs, they're doing useful work, and my answer is, you don't know. Do you just want to be seen to be doing good stuff, or do you actually want to do good stuff? So this is a lot of money. And unless we can answer the causal question, we don't know we're doing good stuff or not. It can look like good stuff, but as if anyone who's an evaluator here in the audience will know, as an evaluator, you find time and time again programs on the face of it look like they make sense, don't work in practice, often for very obvious reasons. And you think, well, why didn't they realize that? And so we do need evaluation that has this lesson learning function about, well, are we really making a difference or not? And this matters a lot in this area. I think it'll come up in the slides. Maybe next slide. Here we go. So here's the theory of change. I don't have the time to go through it, but basically, of course, we're trying to, through these mechanisms, build capacity of local organisation, do lobbying advocacy through various routes. It can be training, it can be workshops, but a lot of it's hands-on experience. Someone's got a mic on and getting feedback. Can you please turn the mic off? Not speaking. A lot of it's through feedback loops, through experience, hands-on experience, and then for engaging jointly in lobbying advocacy activities. And then those organisations learn themselves, do more LNA themselves, and also other organisations locally learn from observations, spillover effects, and so on. Staff moving to new organisations and all that stuff that can happen to have spillover effects. And so. Yeah, I've lost my train of thought. So we want to try and validate this causal chain through what we're looking at. So we are interested in looking at, I know what to say, what the capacity is. And in an area like this, of course, because these are competitive grants people bid for, that you're going to more likely give the money to people who've got a proven track record. So there's a risk that what you're doing is basically using the existing capacity of organisations that can do LNA rather than building capacity to do LNA. So you might enable those organisations to do more LNA they were doing otherwise, but the whole bit about building capacity may not apply because there's a selection bias problem, basically, of giving the money to organisations that already have good capacity in this area. So we're trying to sort that out as part of our evaluation challenge. Next slide. And so here are the evaluation questions. Very straightforward one, and we'll see the answers to this question. What evaluation methods have been used to answer the research question on effectiveness on causal statements? What are the proposed methods adequately applied? And so is it clear what the design is? Did they conduct it in the way it's meant to be conducted? So they've got clear methods like outcome harvesting, contribution analysis, for which there's agreed methods and steps for doing those approaches. And there's been a step change, I would say, in describing methods and being transparent on methods in the studies, but are they fully implementing those methods? And so we try to assess that. Are the evaluation methodology in line with the updated IAB evaluation criteria? So these are updated criteria introduced fairly recently after these evaluations were mostly done. So we're not assessing them against them and saying, you didn't do item 12B, because item 12B didn't exist at the time. So it wouldn't be fair to assess them against that, and that's not what we're doing, but we're seeing the sense to which the new criteria would actually help in assessing whether these evaluations are good designs for making causal statements in this area, and what can be said about achieved results. This actually synthesizing the findings, and particularly what we think are more credible causal statements about how these interventions have worked or not. I would say what we're going to present now is more like, here's the raw data of what we found, and we're still trying to make sense of it. So what we're presenting now is not, here's our final findings, because we're not there yet. We'll be there fairly soon, but we're not there yet. We're sort of sense making out of those findings and trying to look for some big picture messages and to come up with answers to these questions at a sufficiently high level to make sense, but still be concrete enough to be useful. Next slide. Oh, it is the next slide. Okay, so this whole point about this is if you think of monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, we're really on the L. We're trying to be on the L part of this in terms of particularly evaluation methods. So we want to do something that's useful to IOB and to the stakeholders they work in this space, both evaluators and practitioners. And so we've had an external reference group. Some of the members are in this session. We're going to present their findings. We've incorporated, so we coded some additional outcomes, for example, so at the policy change level, particularly the global international partnership level, based on feedback we received earlier on. We've used a scale which we revised based on feedback to communicate about the value, think about the methods. We shared preliminary codes with the organisations who'd have been evaluated, who they may and may not have shared the evaluations, allowed them to feedback on the coding we'd given and are making adjustments as we think appropriate in the light of that. And we're going to do a presentation that anonymizes, of course, all the findings, so you can't identify the individual reports. What we're still doing, the last two bullets, that are not that are after the break are we're working on mid-level theory developments, and it is already one, and that's our basis, but we're trying to get a bit higher up and trying to identify what we think are the key causal mechanisms for both classes of program, LNA and SRHR, in order to assess the appropriateness of these methods for assessing causality in cases, and what sort of causal processes have been adequately tested and what evidence we found, and synthesizing that evidence. So we're trying to be empowering rather than extractive. This is a term from Robert Chambers, where some evaluations basically are extractive. You go and collect the data from people, scurry back to your ivory tower in Europe or North America, analyze the data, publish your report or a paper, and then go on to the next one. And there's no benefit to the people who collected the data from. So an empowering piece of research actually benefits the people that you're collecting the data from. So we're collecting data from the reports produced with a lot of effort. These are huge reports with many, many months or even years' work done by good evaluation teams. And so we want to actually give something back from being able to draw on their work. And that's where we aim to be empowering rather than extractive. Next slide. Oh, I'm not done yet. Can you go to the bubbles? So this is the assessment tool we've used. And so I'm not going to go into detail. It was based on the elaboration of the updated IB guidance and thinking how we could operationalize it in a way that we could actually identify replicable assessments of these studies. So study assessment is something that's done commonly in the field of systematic reviews and evidence synthesis, which is where we come from. It's not done so much in social sciences more generally, but it should be. And so the idea you've got some tool that you can use to assess a study, both in terms of the design, the conduct, and reporting of the evaluation, just makes sense. And we've got a set of criteria where we try to state very clearly what the basis of assessment is, because you rank high, middle, low typically. What's the basis of being ranked high, middle, low? So that if we all went out and run over by a bus, someone could pick up our assessment tool and our guide to the assessment tool and go ahead and make the assessments and get the same results as us. So it's called inter-rater reliability. You don't need to be run over by a bus to test it. You can just get other people to apply the tool. It's a more humane approach. And so we would try and we've aimed for that. So I've just got, I'm nearly done, but we've still got Hikari. So respondent bias, of course, respondents have biases. When you go and ask them about things, they've got reporting bias because they tell you, I mean, it's more like a courtesy bias. They tell you what you want to hear. They've got a self-serving bias of telling you about the great things they did, which also reinforced by self-importance bias. But evaluators have bias. Evaluators have priors. They have a positionality in their own life and in their research experience. They have confirmation bias about their priors. All these sorts of bias that we can try and mitigate against. You can try and minimize the biases. You can't remove biases. You can't remove confirmation biases hardwired into our brains. All you can do is try to minimize the effect of confirmation bias in your study. Okay, next slide, which hopefully is not anymore. Okay, over to you, Hikari. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Do you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Hikari from Campbell Collaboration, and I'm going to talk about our preliminary findings. So these pie charts give us an overview of the methods used by the evaluators. For dialogue and dissent programs, 8 evaluations used outcome harvesting, which is a participatory approach, and 10 evaluations combined outcome harvesting and other approaches such as contribution analysis or most significant change. And 6 evaluations were unclear about their methodology because they only present how they collected data, such as through focus group discussion or key informant interview, but they don't explain with what methodology, with what approaches they analyze the data. For the SRHR programs, 3 evaluations used quasi-experimental design, and the other evaluations mainly used outcome harvesting and contribution analysis. Next slide, please. This is the result of our assessment of the methodology, where gave the confidence rating for each IOB criteria to each evaluation. As you can see, for dialogue and dissent, their strength lies in criteria number 16, which is about reporting of methodology. This means they clearly present evaluation metrics, and also their strength, they're strong in number 17, or use of sufficient information sources, and number 18, triangulation of results from different sources. But it also shows some challenges for the evaluations, especially in number 14, which is about reporting and justification of sampling strategy, and number 19, discussion of bias. The bottom line shows the overall ratings, overall confidence of the study, and they're in general medium or low. Next slide, please. This shows confidence rating for SRHL programs evaluations. So we can see that there's a similar trend, except that these evaluations have higher confidence rate in number 15, the description of data analysis process, and number 21, discussion of limitation. Unlike dialogue and dissent programs, these evaluations on SRHR programs were all medium confidence rating. Next slide, please. So this graph is a summary of the previous two slides, and we present this. We would like to present this slide to highlight that the criteria number 19, the discussion of bias, is a common challenge for both for all of the evaluations we have reviewed. Next slide, please. Here we would like to give example of two study assessment methodology used by the evaluations, but for the sake of time, I will skip this slide. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide is about another findings. We have collected all the outcomes reported for our own evidence synthesis. For dialogue and dissent programs, the top 3 outcome categories were changes in capacity of local organizations and local partners, and community level outcomes. For example, involvement of civil society or awareness of the civil society, or it might be the effects. And also policy implementation outcomes were frequently reported. So about 90% of all the outcome reported are desirable changes. For SRHL programs, outcomes with regard to girls' empowerment, SRHL outcomes such as child marriage and contraception use, and changes in attitude of community members were the most frequently reported outcomes, and 81% of the outcome reported were positive changes. Next slide, please. This graph shows the frequency of outcomes from dialogue and dissent programs by confidence rating of the study and by outcome category. As you can see, in half of the outcomes are from low confidence evaluations. Next slide, please. Here we present the frequencies of outcomes for SRHL evaluation. This slide shows are centered around women's rights and choices. The outcomes with in girls' attitude, other community members' attitudes, and the girls' empowerment frequently reported. But these are all based on the medium confidence evaluations. Next slide, please. Here, so this is the last slide. Here I would like to present some implications. So the first point, so as a result of interaction with the the authors of the evaluations, we felt that some clearer guidance could be provided for the evaluation design, especially on how to describe their theory of change and what elements to be included in the theory of change. And the second point is about so our assessment criteria about the methodology appropriateness of the methodology is based on a set of methodologies that we have. So this guidance should include any methodologies that clearly indicate and aim to verify effectiveness, contribution of the activities to the outcomes. So we observed that some evaluations use case studies, but our assessment, the ratings were high if the case studies use some that incorporate a methodology to do this. The third point is about, so we observed that there was an issue with reporting of what was actually done. So many evaluators said that they considered some limitation regarding the bias, but they couldn't describe all the discussion about bias because of the space limitation. So this issue might be addressed by creating evaluation templates. And there was also an issue with methods. For example, attempts to rule out alternative explanations for changes in outcome, or attempts to protect against respondent or evaluators' biases were done but not reported. So this can also be addressed by making evaluation checklists.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hikari, and also thank you, Howard, also for pointing out that we are looking for lessons on evaluation methods in this important domain that are credible in their causality, in their causal claims, and that are appropriate for lobby and advocacy efforts, team efforts, I might ask, Nordic team efforts perhaps, and also lessons, as Hikari pointed out, for the IOB criteria themselves. I would welcome the attendees to also put questions in the discussion forum, but now I'd like to give the floor to Jos Vaessen as the first of our panelists for a short reflection on what he just heard. Jos.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you also to Hugh, Howard, and Hikari for excellent presentation. So I would like to make 3 points regarding the use of methods on this type of programs. So first of all, it's useful to note that the study concludes that methodological quality is quite okay across the board, across many of the criteria, but also at the same time highlights a number of criteria and a number of areas for improvement. And my points speak to those areas of improvement. Now, my first point is related to the methodological approaches used to examine causal change. The study really makes a very helpful difference between, let's say, group 1 approaches and group 2 approaches, where group 1 approaches are some type of theory-based approach that systematically examines the causal chain of how an intervention brings about change, whereas group 2 approaches are around primarily based on some kind of participatory inquiry, where there's a lot of triangulation across stakeholder views. Now, this distinction is important in the sense that the second set of approaches offers less handholds to systematically assess causal change in contrast to the first. Doesn't mean that the second group cannot bring about evidence, cannot generate evidence on causality that is valid, but we have less handholds to have confidence in the evidence that is being generated. So in my view, it would be recommendable that evaluations use at least some type of approach from group 1. And so this would be some type of approach such as contribution analysis, QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, or process tracing, or a similar theory-based approach. Now, there are many reasons to justify this claim, and I just would like to point out one methodological principle which is often comes up in process tracing, which I think is very important to keep in mind when doing qualitative research, also qualitative causal research. Now, this is the principle of probative value. So the idea that not every piece of evidence, qualitative evidence, is equal to another piece of evidence. For example, it makes a difference if you ask the views of a stakeholder who is an implementing partner or beneficiary of a program regarding the program's success, or you ask the same to an independent observer who may also know the program very well. These two views are different in terms of probative value. Also, there's a difference in whether the qualitative data about the program or potentially achieved program outcome is based on, let's say, a respondent's claim that is in the guise of, I think that the program has made an impact, or whether this comes from a very detailed, elaborate account or detailed story on how the program is making a difference systematically. So the latter can be captured in interview transcripts, and you can also use computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software to really make a difference between these two types of evidence. One is much more detailed and potentially more trustworthy than the other. And of course, triangulation also benefits from this differentiation. So that's my first point, the need to use some causal approach from the group 1 that offers more handholds to systematically look at the causal chain. My second point is an observation made by the study regarding the reporting on the influence of context on outcomes. And the study says that very few studies clearly describe the intervention context. And this for me is quite a noteworthy finding and also a little bit worrying. As we all know, the epistemological movement, critical realism, which underpins, for example, realist evaluation, but also related approaches that rely on some configurational approach to causal change, they start out from the premise that interventions, they do not work universally. It's not as if you put A, B, C, and D in place, they will work. They work under specific circumstances, and these circumstances may differ across countries, across groups, across institutional settings, etc. So consequently, if you want to understand causal change, you have to understand context. So I think that is an element that certainly in future guidance to evaluations, improvements can be made. And then finally, my third point, we are talking about bringing about change in policy, but also changes in awareness levels and attitudes of citizens. For example, in the case of sexual and reproductive health interventions, interventions are trying to change women's and men's awareness levels on the importance of sexual reproductive health and the use of sexual and reproductive health services. Now, changing these awareness levels and attitudes really takes time because they are embedded in deeper lying norms and belief systems about, regarding the role of the family or the power balance between men and women and so on. So what you essentially want to change is also these deeper lying norms and belief systems, but that really requires time. You cannot change them overnight or even in a few years. It means that interventions have to be in there for the long haul, but it also means that evaluations have to take a longer term perspective when looking at causal change in those situations. So these are my 3 points, and I'll stop here. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you, dear panelist. Jos Vaessen, excellent. I remind all attendees to ask questions using the discussion forum, so we can have an informed discussion afterwards. But now I'd like to invite Karel Chambille to give his reflections. Karel.
interventions. I think mine will be slightly different, which may also be related to my background. I was in the external reference group, or I am in the external reference group, but I'm also one of the evaluation commissioners of the evaluations being studied. And I think I was consistent in my earlier interventions in the external reference group when I now say that the point on empowering versus extractive that Howard made is one that I think is very important. And probably that will also be true for other evaluation commissioners who are in the audience. So I'm happy that this attitude was taken by the team. And to give another twist to the term context, which Jos mentioned, it is important to also understand the context in which this study takes place, in which IUB is an actor, in which we as organizations are actors, and in which the other departments of the ministry are actors. And the context has been one of, and I'm now referring to the past 2 years, of very negative comments on outcome harvesting as an approach. When I look at the slide Hikari presented, there are only a few evaluations that did not use outcome harvesting as their approach. So I also have the impression from the presentations and from what I was able to read from the first preliminary findings in the report, that that negative attitude towards outcome harvesting is no longer there. And I think that is very important. To maybe say even something stronger, it should not surprise people who look at the evaluations that you studied that outcome harvesting has been so prominent in approaches, because it was recommended by the ministry itself. If we look at the TUC document that was produced in 2017, outcome harvesting was mentioned as one of the approaches that could be followed. So that's one element about context and happiness that I have with the empowering approach. A very important other element linked to empowerment is that you communicate with the stakeholders. And one way or the other, we as stakeholders, we who commission these evaluations, are equally responsible as the evaluation teams who carried them out for the final products. So if you take your idea of learning, as Howard said, so seriously, then yes, please engage with us at a level where this learning can take place. And this immediately confronts a limitation of the study that was undertaken on two aspects. One, the team was only able to look at the evaluation reports or only part of the evaluation documents, and had very few possibilities of communicating either with the commissioners or with the evaluation teams who carried them out. So that's a limitation. In general, I hope this exercise can contribute to a more relaxed atmosphere when it comes to the whole area of doing evaluations. I would like to ask IUB to be aware of its effect it has in this triangle that I was talking about. We were confronted with a question, oh, can we still do outcome harvesting? They tell us we can't do that anymore. So people who had less time in dealing with these issues became a bit scared and frightened. And I hope it will be possible to do away with this. That's one important point. Make sure that those who commission the evaluations recognize themselves in the assessments that you make. That will take some time. It may not only be possible on the basis of written exchange. And I cannot speak for all of the evaluations being studied, but here then I put on my own other hat, which is one of being commissioner of one of the evaluations. So far, it was not possible for me to see that there was justice sufficiently done to the documents that our evaluation consisted of. Simply, and that's very, very simple, simply because these documents were not made available to the team. So, and I know that my other colleague in the reference group had a similar point. So I would hope that you as a team are confident that you have communicated sufficiently with the commissioners and possibly with evaluators that, yes, you have taken into account the assessment and people's comments to these assessments. That's one big area of my comment. And the second one relates to the notion of what is a theory of change. And although I'm not able to pinpoint very precisely what I'm going to say in the document, I have a sensation that we are talking, or the document is talking about, what we are going to prove or find evidence for is for our theories of change. And I would say that's not what this is about. We want evidence for the effectiveness of the interventions that were carried out, irrespective of a theory of change that might have been there or not. And there is an interaction between these two elements, but at times I get a sort of very theoretical understanding that people have of what theories of change are. And in practice, now I can speak for HIVOS, the word adaptive is mentioned in the report. Adaptive management in a program that goes for 5 years does not have the same theory of change at the beginning and at the end. So theory of change is much more a sort of framework or guidance that in processes of review also helps an implementing organization or an implementing team of organizations to do its work properly. So I'm not saying that therefore you should not look at a theory of change at all, but it's about the interaction between these. So that element of the practice of implementing lobby and advocacy programs needs to be well understood by evaluators, but also by the team that now assesses the evaluations. And then I'm going to be very short. Last question is the slide Hikari showed about the outcome, the connection between the outcomes and the rating that was given to the evaluation studies. I know that in systematic reviews, the studies that score low are just kicked out because there are so many studies and they base their review only on a limitation. I have not seen you doing that, or maybe you want to do that. That's a technical question I have about the further progress of your work. That's what I would like to contribute.
Okay, thank you very much, Karel. I saw a heart flying across your screen, so it's well heard also with the attendees. You came across loud and clear also about the importance of commissioners and the support and the recognition that that is always, of course, very important if you want to take up of evaluation results, and that includes this evaluation. So thank you very much for your reflection. I would now like to invite Casey Davison-O'Brien to share his thoughts with us.
Great, thank you. And again, just a big thank you to the presenters for their presentation. Really, really interesting. I enjoyed reading their draft report, and I look forward to the final version. So interestingly, my notes document has frozen, so I've sort of at the 11th hour prepared some slightly different points to flag, but that's fine because it's been very helpful listening to both Karel and Joss as well. So I wanted to kind of bring things back to quite a pragmatic perspective, and I'll just make a quick introduction as well. So my name is Casey. I work for Frontline AIDS. We're a international NGO based in the UK, and we worked with AIDS funds to deliver the partnership to inspire, transform and connect the HIV response, which was the pitch program under Dialogue and Dissent. So the first point I wanted to speak to was really about taking a step back from this discussion about evaluations and looking more broadly at the kinds of monitoring and evaluation and learning systems and processes that are actually set up and put in place during the inception phases of programs funded under initiatives such as Dialogue and Dissent, because I firmly believe that actually the extent to which commissioners, consultants, funders are able to contribute to effective evaluations that clearly demonstrate sort of evidence-driven, evidence-based causal chains, causal pathways, etc. That a lot of this rests on, you know, a number of years of an effective MEL system being delivered and being set up to start with. So, speaking from my own experience of the pitch program, we had intentionally quite a light touch MEL system in place. We were working with over 100 sort of civil society organizations, some ranging from quite small, poorly structured CBOs right through to well-recognized, well-funded, well-structured national NGOs, quite a diverse variety of organizations. We had an annual reporting process in place that allowed partners to report on progress in line with a set of 25 performance indicators that allowed us to kind of understand year in, year out how partners were self-perceiving progress in line with capacity strengthening targets, in line with influencing sort of objectives and targets towards key advocacy targets that are identified, and support this end of year reporting process. We would sort of pursue that sort of monitoring as evaluation approach that's been spoken about in other fora, whereby we would hold annual meetings, allowing for partners to kind of come together and share sort of findings, share reflections on barriers and sort of enablers to progress, etc. And to complement that, we also used an online monitoring system where an advocacy log template was created. And speaking to a point that was made earlier about understanding context, this advocacy log methodology actually allowed for tracking and monitoring of not just of performance by partners, but also to track significant shifts in national, regional, global context that actually impacted their advocacy strategy, their campaigns, creating space for actual ongoing learning and adaptive sort of planning and adaptive management throughout the course of the program. The reason I mention this is because actually throughout the course of the program, although we felt broadly satisfied with the MEL system, for various reasons, I would say, you know, speaking quite candidly, I would say insufficient thought was given to how the system would sort of feed into necessarily and support the final evaluation program, which strategy will be most, which methodology will be most appropriate and relevant to use. We introduced actually outcome harvesting to the program fairly late in the day, in the penultimate year of the program. We had a quite successful rollout of the methodology, but I would say that actually we were one of the programs that one of the partnerships that used outcome harvesting as one of the main methodology in the evaluation. But I would say that actually, on reflection, this methodology should have been introduced earlier, but it also raises a question for me about the experiences of other strategic partnerships when it comes to their choice to use outcome harvesting, outcome mapping, contribution analysis, or other methodology. You know, there's a question here: to what extent were these methodologies introduced in a timely way to the program, to partners, you know, across the breadth of the program? To what extent do we feel as evaluation commissioners, to what extent do we feel that our colleagues globally were prepared and ready to engage in a participatory but quite time-consuming process in a way that would allow for the most robust, objective, evidence-based results? So I'm aware of time. I'll try and be quick on the next 2 points. The next 2 points I had to raise was really a reflection I had again on this question around understanding how in practice to live up to the standards that we set ourselves to understand rival hypotheses around causal pathways, causal chains, and the extent to which there are opportunities for strategic partnerships to get better at peer-to-peer learning from one another during the course of a program period. My impression during the lifetime of the Dialogue and Dissent initiative was that whilst UMEZAWA was good actually at creating spaces periodically for strategic partnership representatives to kind of come together and to learn. There was actually more, I think, that the strategic partnerships ourselves could have done to reach out, to do very like to actually share knowledge around what we were seeing in terms of shifts in context, to share knowledge around the results of stakeholder mapping exercises, and to actually share insights into what our analysis of evidence and data that we were collecting told us about our contribution to change, in order to actually develop a more comprehensive really mapping of what, as a collection of partnerships, we were actually achieving, in real time. And I think to my last point, then again, it sort of speaks back to my first point in some ways. There's this sort of challenge inherent in relying, and again, speaking from my own experience, relying on busy, stressed civil society organizations, CBOs, to provide, meaningful, objective, relevant data for several years in a row, when we're dealing with, often human rights activists, advocates, campaigners working in very pressing scenarios, many of whom have experienced arbitrary arrest, detention, intimidation from the authorities. To what extent are there lessons that we can learn or opportunities to kind of get better at, on the one hand, ensuring meaningful participation, but on the one hand, supporting some of those principles around, doing development differently, working to kind of recognize the importance of the role of civil society activists, whilst also giving them the resources, giving them the meaningful space to actually engage in that meaningful way, and better understanding some of those asymmetric power dynamics between INGOs based in Europe and North America predominantly, and then the people whom we fundamentally rely on for results, for data, for evidence, etc. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll have time for input from others as well.
Well, thank you, Casey. I saw the virtual equivalent of applauding flying across your screen when you were talking. So also your contribution has been valued by the. There are two questions. There's a question in the discussion forum, and there's also a response on programs taking up more time for implementation, achieving more results. I think that's an important one. We can look into this, but I would be, Hugh, are you willing to share some of your reflections on the questions in the discussion forum, please?
Yeah, so Hugh still can't speak, I don't think. So I'll try and pick up a couple.
Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, so there's one that Hugh has responded to there, which is about long run. I forget who's that, it's Karel. It takes a long time to achieve these outcomes of changing attitudes and it's Jos, changing attitudes and behavior, which means changing underlying norms. That takes years, if anything. And so the interventions need to take years, and the evaluations need to take years, or at least need to be done after a long period of time. And I'm entirely sympathetic to that. It applies also to large quantitative impact evaluations, where I see, in my career as an evaluator, I've seen a lot of pressure for what I call premature impact evaluations. It's just like, been going for 6 months, and now you're saying, where's the impact? Where's the impact? Well, it's going to take time. Okay, and we have to recognize that. And a good theory of change has a temporal dimension. And so it shows you the time after which you expect observed change, outputs to be achieved, outcomes to be, intermediate and final outcomes to be achieved, and so on. And so that can help you plan actually when you should address which evaluation questions and when. So in the shorter term and even the medium term, you might be looking more at intermediate outcomes, because you can't expect the final outcomes to be achieved. And it'd be a big mistake to write off programs as having failed when they haven't achieved things that cannot be reasonably expect to be achieved in that time frame. And I think we have to be honest about that. And I think the funders, Mbuza, have to be honest, have to recognise that and be honest about it. And I mean, similar. There's the questions that were just raised around implementation. I think that's a very good, the sort of question we really like to look at. So what are the program design features that are associated with higher observed effects? So it was mentioned in the chat, I think, Yeah, it's there in the chat. The one thing that's commonly correlated with higher observed effects is weaker evaluation designs. And many systematic reviews find that for effectiveness studies, but we also find it for in qualitative studies. So, to use Joss's standards of evidence, a bloke who met down the pub just saying, "Oh yeah, this really had a big effect," is a lower piece of evidence in an evidence hierarchy when actually someone deeply involved in the program explaining, well, the program came and did this, that, and the other, and that enabled us to do this and that, and by doing this and that led to so and so, and this engagement with these stakeholders we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do, and because of the support we are able to engage over a deep and long period of time doing these certain activities with parliamentarians or whatever, a convincing story is better than just vouching for, oh, it's had an impact. I mean, I must admit, though, I shouldn't say in this forum, just having quantitative evidence of the form, oh yes, there was impact, I just discount as being valid evidence. Whereas evidence of stories that seem credible, I think can be of high quality. Why am I talking about this? So I know why I'm talking about this. So there's a lot of questions we would like to dig into around, say, so we often have a finding around study quality being linked to causal claims and strength of causal claims and in inverse relationship, but we're not interested just in that. We are interested in learning lessons about program design and implementation features, characteristics that are also associated with more credible and larger effects and sustainable effects. And we would like to tease that out, and the same in all systematic reviews, have aspirations to tease a heterogeneity. It's always more challenging than it sounds, because you can find an individual case where it supports an argument around that, but an individual case won't wash. But if you can find half a dozen cases where you can say, well, there's certain design features associated with these sort of things going on, these causal processes operating, to me that becomes credible. Using case study approaches and saturation means you don't need huge numbers of case studies, but you do need more than one. And so we will certainly try to look at, try and dig down in more detail to try and get in depth. It's a huge undertaking. Like I said, these reports, even the Karel meant to point that we were looking at the reports alone and not always all the annexes. So we have got the annexes and we have gone to those for the coding where necessary. The original terms of reference are often in the annexes. So we have had quite a lot of this information. The management matrices we've had to use are in the annexes, but we have to dig. And this is coming to hundreds of pages. So to dig deeply across 60, nearly 70 of these reports is a great deal of work, and we've got limited time, as all evaluators have limited time and budget, and we'd like to always want to do more, but we'll do the best we can. Let me stop there because we are over time.
Yeah, because time constraints are also applicable to this session, I'm afraid. Well, I would say that this is an extremely useful debate and very good for the study that we are doing. I think the discussion on findings being more positive connected to one type of evaluation is an interesting one. I strongly believe myself in fit for purpose evaluations, and that also relates to the discussion on theory of changes and learning throughout the implementation, which may indeed lead to a change of the theory itself. So thank you very, very much. We take all the lessons. That also applies to my colleagues Ferko and Casper who are in this session. Thank you, attendees. Feel free to share your thoughts also after the session with either Howard's team or us. Thank you very much, Hugh, Howard, and Hikari for your excellent presentation, and Jos, Karel, and Casey for your excellent reflections. This has been a true learning experience. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Peter, for chairing, and thank you for discussing. These were very useful comments. We've written them all down, and we'll be discussing them. So thank you very much. And for the participants also for taking part.
Thanks all. Good to meet you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.